Greetings and welcome to Unit 11, Public Policy in Texas. In this lecture, we will discuss the underlying controversies in making public policy, describe the 5 stages in making public policy in Texas, identify the key policy issues and challenges in Texas, and outline the actions that individual can make to impact policy decision making here in the great state of Texas. So, without further delay, let's dive right into this. Okay, so there are 2 types of policy that we probably know, right? We have foreign policy, which is, the U.S. Policy with other nations, right? This can include trade. This can include, military aid. This can include treaties, trade agreements, all these various things, right? That deals with other nations. That's foreign policy. Domestic policy is, policies that are focused on the citizens of the United States and their well-being. So within domestic policy, there is another type that we're going to talk about extensively in this lecture, and that is public policy. Okay? Public policy is the broad strategy that government uses to do its job. The relatively stable set of purposive governmental behaviors that address matters of concern to some part of society. Now, which part of society is actually pretty easy for us to answer? That is, those who vote. And I'm being quite serious about that. If you've ever wondered, why candidates talk about certain issues that they do, why legislation that's passed only deals with, that specific population. Let me put it another way. If you've ever wondered why our candidates only talk about issues that pertain to older individuals and legislation that's passed deals with, issues pertaining to those older individuals, look no further than voting behavior. Here's what I mean. Those who are older, we vote frequently, very frequently. Doesn't matter if there's a storm outside. Doesn't matter if it's cold, hot, hurricane, a global pandemic. Nothing is going to prevent us from voting. Okay, nothing. No life inconvenience. No, nothing like that. Nothing's going to prevent us from casting our vote. Historically speaking, those who are older vote consistently and very faithfully. In other words, they vote in every election. Those who are younger, we don't faithfully, frequently vote. Yes, we do, and occasionally we do come out to vote for specific special elections, especially if there's one specific candidate we want to win. Absolutely. I'm not saying we can't be immobilized. I'm not saying that mobilized. I'm not saying that it's impossible. What I'm saying is we don't do it frequently enough to where we set voter trends over time. I mean, we do. It's just the trend is we don't vote. So that's the thing. It seems like we vote more. We don't vote more than we do. And if we change that voting behavior, we would actually change and shape the discussions that elected officials have, candidates have. We would shift some of what's done in the legislature, whether we're talking about the national level or at the state level. We would change policy outcomes. But that's not going to be done overnight. We can't just show up to one election and expect for everything to change. That's not how this works. unfortunately, or fortunately, depending on who you ask. But the point here is that some part of society gets their concerns addressed, and those who do are the ones who vote. That's what I'm trying to get at here. And we can change that, like I said, if we faithfully and regularly vote in every election. So let's talk about now, let's move on and talk about the types of policy. Because there are 3 types that we need to know, right? We have distributive policy, which is a policy that collects payments or resources broadly, but concentrates direct benefits on relatively few. Now, one example that's like the prime example is the highways, right? Another type of policy is regulatory policy. That is a policy that regulates companies and organizations in a way that protects the people. So in other words, companies, through regulatory policies, through regulation, companies cannot just put chemicals into the air without knowledge. They have to know what we're putting into the air is safe for the public. Right? Often these types of regulatory policies help with environment, public safety and health. Right? The idea of a So the idea of companies just polluting the air, for example, going back to that idea that if it violates a regulatory policy, the government can actually hold that organization or that company accountable, responsible for such damage. Anyways, the third type is redistributive policy, which is a policy that costs are borne by a relatively small number or a small number of groups or individuals, but benefits are expected to be enjoyed by a different group in society. So an easier way to understand redistributive policy is think of it like Robin Hood. The idea of taking away from one group and giving it to a completely different group. Right? That's one of the nicknames it's used actually is redistributive policies are a Robin Hood policy. Okay. Some examples of redistributive policies, we have the Head Start, which is an educational program. We have Medicaid, which is healthcare. We have the Temporary Assistance for Needy Families, the TANF. Food programs like Supplementary Nutritional Aid Program, known as SNAP, and other food stamps programs. Right? These are redistributive policies. This idea that we are taking away from a group, and giving this resource or giving a resource to another group. That's separate from the original. So these are the 3 types, and what's interesting to note is just the type of policy that you are seeking, the type of policy that a legislature is trying to pass, or a legislator is trying to pass. This can be a source of conflict, not only between representatives, but also between political parties, and of course you and I, right? If you're trying to pass a bill that is a redistributive policy, right? You can imagine the other side saying, well, this is a form of socialism, or we don't need this. We don't have that here. Even though we've already established, right, that we have some redistributive policies already. Does that mean that we're socialist? Well, no, right? So, but you can still understand how this can be a source of contention. That just to even forget what issue you're trying to deal with, right? Just the type of policy can be a source of, again, conflict. I digress. Let's now move on to the steps, the stages. Okay, there is a 5-cycle or 5 stages of public policy, and let's dive into what these are. Okay, so first is again problem, a problem definition, or should I say a problem is defined, right? This idea that a problem has been brought to our attention, and our attention being like the legislature. So this can be done in several ways. Okay, this could be done by trial and error. For example, the legislature could pass a certain law, and the executive branch, who's in charge of implementing the law, can give feedback saying, "Hey, we've implemented this law, but we've ran into some snags. We ran into some barriers that unfortunately we don't have the power, because they cannot pass laws. They can only implement. That if you could change it, if you could change the law, it will make it much easier to fulfill what you were trying to accomplish in the beginning." That's one way, trial and error. Another way to bring up an issue, right, is elected officials. They campaign on issues, and once they get elected, they can introduce bills to address that problem they brought up to our attention. Another way is you and I. Now, this can be done in 2 ways. But we can bring it up through public opinion. We can bring issues and problems up to the attention of the news media, and having it talked about so much through the media will grab the attention of our legislators, of our representatives. Another way we could do it is lobbying. Now remember, I spoke about, or I've lectured before about what lobbying is, right? Well, we can lobby. That is to say that you and I could go wait in the lobby of a legislator and talk with them about a problem that we have. We can define the problem. Now that can go hand in. We can also, it mirrors, it's almost very similar to what I just said, but we can contact them through email, through official channels, and by calling up their offices. I know an individual who calls up their representatives once a week. Once a week, to let them know what they're thinking. Right? So that's how, right? So trial and error through, a bill has been passed, it's been implemented, but there's some problems. There's been some implementation problems that needs to be addressed by the legislature. Another way is for issues that the legislator or a representative has brought up to our attention through campaigning, right? Once they get elected, they introduce bills to address said problem. And then, of course, you and I, our input, for which we can give, not only through media, but directly to our elected officials. Right? So we define a problem. Okay, somehow, whether that's, again, done by trial and error, whether that's done by the representative, or whether it's done by us, we define a problem. And then we have agenda setting. That is to say that we have the problem, we've defined it, now let's put it on the ticket, now let's put it on up for debate. Let's debate this. Let's debate about ways that we can address this issue. We've already defined the problem, we don't have to redefine it. But now let's talk about solutions to that problem. How do we address it? And of course, ideology comes into play. Party affiliation comes into play. How we view the world, how we view society, how we view the state has a direct interplay here with how we come up with a solution to whatever this problem is. Okay? So we have agenda setting. And then we get policy adoption. After the arguments, after the debates, after we've combed through the possible solutions to the problem, we built up a consensus to a specific one, And now we ask the one basic, simple question. Do we adopt it? Should we adopt it? This is kind of a binary decision, right? Yes or no. Should we do it? Yes or no. Right? But it's the adoption process. Right? We've defined it. We've talked about it. We've debated it. We've come up with a particular solution to it. Now it's up to the question: should we adopt it? Right? The fourth stage is implementation. So after the problem has been defined, after we've argued about it, we've argued about the various ways we could potentially address this problem. We've come up with the adoption of it. We've adopted a particular resolution or a particular solution to this problem. Now it's up for the implementation. Now it goes from the legislative process to the executive. Now here's where the governor can implement the law or this bill that was passed by the legislature, right? It was argued. It was asked, should we do it? Yes or no? Yes. If the majority says yes, it gets sent to the governor. The governor here is responsible for implementation. So, implementing a law. This is where the executive gets to put the law into play, right? And there's some discretion that the governor or the executive has with this particular at this particular stage, right? They can issue executive orders, which are guidelines, right, for how this law should be implemented, right? It's implementation guidelines. But just remember, the executive, whether we're talking about the presidential level or if we're talking about the state level, the executive does not have the authority to make new law. Okay, we just keep that in mind, right? Just always have that in mind. But now it's up to the executive to implement the law passed by the legislature. And then the final stage is evaluation. Simply put, the law that was passed and the law that was implemented, the way that was implemented, is it addressing the problem as the legislature originally intended it for it to do? Is there any negative consequence or side effects? Is it doing exactly what the legislature originally intended? If the answer is yes, then we're good to go, right? But if the answer is no, then it needs to go through a refinement process. Is that through, again, implementation? Does it need to be implemented differently? Or does it need to be changed fundamentally through the legislative process? But the point here is this five stages of public policy, right? Defining a problem, putting it on the agenda. Let's debate it. What are the solutions to this particular problem? Should we adopt this policy, yes or no? Then the executive implements this policy passed, and then we evaluate it. Right? The bureaucracy evaluates whether or not, okay, does this do what it was originally intended to do? Right? So that's the 5 stages. So you might be asking the universal question, right, of why does it matter? Well, it matters because public policy at the state level, it impacts us on 3 dimensions, which are very critical. Right? It impacts us economically, legally, and socially. Case in point. Public policy has the ability to impact our bank account, has a way to impact our pocketbook. Public policy also has a way of, adding barriers to our ability, our right to vote. And public policy has a way to impact us socially, like who we can marry, right? this is significant. Public policy is significant. And let us not forget, right? Politics absolutely affects us. It absolutely does. Look no farther than here to see the impact. Right? I mean, there is so much that can be said about that, about how much it does affect us, right? Everything from government regulation of our electricity or lack thereof, that impacts us. Just ask those who experience a winter storm that their power was knocked out for days at a time, or those who are experiencing a summer heat wave, right, with no working air conditioner because the because the electricity is out, because again, lack of regulation, or take a look at the food that you buy from the grocery stores, that best buy or best used by date on it, that's done by regulation, right? Whether or not, again, there's so many other things we could dive into. And we're about to take a look at some policy areas here, right? We're about to take a look at some very specific issues, and which might hammer the point just a little bit more, right? But the point here is it matters because it affects us. And it affects us economically, legally, and socially. All right, so let's dive into some specific areas of policy in Texas. So let's dive into the right to bear arms. Okay, gun control versus gun rights. We need to talk about this, and this is going to take some time because there's a lot to unpack with this particular debate. Gun control versus gun rights. The idea, there's a struggle here that we are experiencing between what government should do about, gun violence versus our right to own guns. There is a struggle to find a safe balance between these two concepts, right? So just make sure we're on the same page. Gun control is referring to adding regulations, adding additional regulations onto our right to own a gun. Gun rights is advocating for less restrictions or less regulation on guns. So just so we're clear on it. So one thing that we need to understand, and we're about to dive deep into the Second Amendment here in just a second. But one thing, well, you know what? No, let me pause. Let's dive into the Second Amendment. Let's dive into it. So the Second Amendment of the U.S. Bill of Rights reads as follows, and I quote, "A well-regulated militia being necessary to the security of a free state, the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed." Period. Now this makes it pretty clear, right? That the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed, shall not be limited or regulated. But let's read that again, okay? Because we have to understand the Second Amendment is literally one sentence. Now I'm not an English professor, okay? But but I do understand basic sentence structure, okay? So let's read this again. A well-regulated militia, comma, being necessary to the security of a free state, comma, the right of the people to keep and bear arms, comma, shall not be infringed. Period. Now, is the Second Amendment referring to we, you and I, we the people? Or is it referring to the military, the militia? If we read it that way, if we read it as it applies to a militia, then the idea that we have to have it to hunt, right? There's no argument here, because it's only applying to those within a militia, if we read it that way. Now, if we read it a different way, if we read it as just I said it just a moment ago, the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. And if that's the only part that we focus on, okay, let's talk about that. All right. So let's talk about what is an arm. Can you define what that is for me? Because I'm having a hard time over here. Is it a gun? Is it an assault weapon? Is it military equipment? Is it a biological weapon? Is it a nuclear weapon? Well, if we define, because the Constitution just says bear arms. That's all it says. So, is an arm then a nuclear device? Well, if that's the case, do I have the right, according to the Second Amendment, to own a biological, chemical, or nuclear weapon? I think most of us would say no. Even those of us who are advocates for gun rights, I don't think you would say that I have the right to own such a device, such a weapon, right? Now I know it's an extreme, right? But bear with me. Again, arm is not defined here. It just says arms. So what is an arm? Like I said, most of us would say that you and I, we do not own a right to have a nuclear weapon in our bedroom, in our basement, or in our living room, wherever the case may be. So already, without overthinking this too much, we've already established that we are willing to accept certain limitations on our right to bear arms, assuming that we do not think that this applies only to a militia, okay, only to those who join the military. If we broadly read it as, just you and I have the right to bear arms, then we've already established that there is one regulation that we agree with, and that is there are certain weapons, i.e., nuclear, biological, chemical weapons of mass destruction. I am not allowed, you're not allowed, other people are not allowed to have such weapons. So we have one regulation, one restriction, one infringement that we agree on. The question now is, are there other limitations that we are willing to accept? Now here's one thing about the Second Amendment that bothers me. This is one thing that bothers me. That we tend to hold it as this absolute statement that we cannot do anything to affect gun rights. We can't do a thing. Yet when it comes to the First Amendment, right, the right to free speech, certain speech, there's consequences for that. We put limitations on the press, which is protected under the First Amendment. We want to ban or we want to limit how much a specific religion has, that we place limitations in schools on certain religions, right? Or we want to advance one religion over another, which is a violation, by the way, of the First Amendment. Right? So the point I'm trying to get at here is, with the amount of rhetoric that we can't do anything about the Second Amendment because it's clear as day. Well, we should apply that to this First Amendment as well, along with the Third, Fourth, Fifth, Eighth, Ninth Amendments. Right? Why cherry pick? Why cherry pick? So, the question for society, and it's not put in this way, and I wish it would. I wish it was. Not because I want to be clear about one thing. I'm not advocating for gun control or for gun rights. I am not. What I'm simply doing is trying to go through the arguments of both here, right? And one of the things that hurts us debating this is this sense of, it says shall not be infringed. We can't do anything about that. Well, no. There are limitations. I've already established we're willing to accept. the question for society and the question for you and I to answer, and this all comes down to our ideology. The question is how. The question is what. Sorry, let me rephrase that. The question for us to answer is what other limitations are we willing to accept? Are we willing to accept other limitations? Do we read this and say, no, shall not be infringed? Period. Full stop. There is nothing for us to debate here. Or do we say, okay, well, there's certain limitations, so what common ground can we agree on? Those who advocate for gun control, is there any other common ground that those who advocate for gun rights, is there common ground for us to share? Beyond, there is one thing that we can all agree to, right? And that's that you and I are not allowed, nor should we own nuclear weapons or weapons of mass destruction. Now, how do you define a WMD? I'm using a very specific definition established by the UN, but that's not here though. Anyways, so this debate about gun violence involves firearm deaths and the impact of gun ownership, criminal and legal, on gun violent outcomes. Right. So we know what this debate is. Right? Today we do see eased restrictions on guns, allowing them to be carried in places of worship, i.e., churches, during disasters, and in rented and leased properties like apartments. What's interesting about this particular issue, right? Restrictions on what's interesting to me is that when a tragedy happens, we can't talk about it. Only thoughts and prayers. That bothers me. And let me explain why that bothers me. Again, I'm not advocating one way or the other. Okay? I'm not. But what's so agonizing for me is that you're limiting debate. You're limiting discussion. If the majority want... Let me back up and say it like this. If we don't talk about it when it's fresh on our minds, when are we going to talk about it? We have a very short attention span. After about 3 days up to a week of a tragedy, we lose sight of what's happened. And we go on with our daily lives and we don't think about that stuff again. Unless we were personally involved in that tragedy. We don't think about it. So, if not now, when? When a tragedy strikes, if not now, when? It's not politicizing it. It's having an honest discussion. And that right there, I love honest discussion. Now, again, whether you agree with whether we should do something or whether you agree we shouldn't do anything, that's not here or there. But the simple fact that we can't have that conversation at all is problematic. I am digressing. Let's move on now to civil rights. Let's move on to civil rights here. So we have seen the Texas legislature, okay, limit athletic participation by transgender students. The legislature was able to get that passed. We've seen the legislature try to pass bills that this transgender bathroom bill that basically what it said was you can only use the bathroom that corresponds with your gender that you are assigned at birth. We also see classifying gender affirming care as child abuse. Now these last two here, this transgender bathroom bill and classifying gender affirming care as child abuse, these two were actually failed. These failed in the legislature. They didn't pass. But the point here is that this is a policy concern. This is a policy issue that we're facing here in Texas. Okay? K through 12 education, operated by local school districts and superintendents. Basic allotment guarantees that every school district a certain amount of funding for each student, and the amount per student is determined each legislative session. Education is a huge, problem's not the word, is a huge policy issue for Texas. This is one of the, every year, every 2 years, because our legislature's in session every 2 years, right? Once every 2 years. This is a big issue. How do we fund? How much funding? Should teachers get raises or not? These types of issues. This is brought up to the legislature, and they have to deal with this every legislative session. So many educators argue that state should regularly increase the base number to match the increase in inflation to provide schools with the funding they need. However, the basic allotment per student has not changed substantially since 2010, and we know that inflation has rise and hurts, right? So that's what educators argue. Now, in terms of higher education, again, remember that the higher education, we have about 268 colleges and universities here in the great state of Texas. Public institutions are regulated by the Texas Higher Education Coordinating Board, the THECB. And one of the issues facing higher education is the overall politicizing of education. And I'm not joking about that, right? We've seen states ban books in public schools. It's just a matter of time before this hits higher education, right? So are we politicizing education too much? This idea of CRT, right? Which, by the way, we need to be clear about what CRT is, right? CRT is critical race theory, which is a theory that is discussed in a graduate program. We really don't discuss it here, right? Now, if you redefine CRT as something that it's not, well then okay. CRT basically, the theory states that we've had our political system, our government, our system of government has been racist throughout time. And with some evidence, i.e., we had our U.S. Constitution literally said that black people were 3/5 of a person. I think it's safe to say that that's racist. The fact that we had to pass a constitutional amendment within my grandparents' lifetime that guaranteed that, that black people were allowed to vote. I think, well, I don't know if this is going too far to say that, yes, we've seen some history of this. So by just talking about that history, is that CRT? I'm going to say no. But you may say yes. I worry, though, about the over politicizing education. I really do. I think this is a problem. College is here for us to discuss things freely, to exchange ideas freely. Not all ideas are good, by the way. Not all theories are provable or excellent. That doesn't mean, though, that we need to ban ideas. That doesn't mean that we need to ban theories. And I fear that's what's coming next. Hopefully I'm wrong, but that's a concern for which I have. All right. So now let's talk about voting policy, because there is a lot to unpack with this. Okay, we have restrictive versus voting rights. Restrictive. What are we referring to when we say restrictive? Well, we're not talking about an absolute ban on voting. That's not what we're talking about. But what we are talking about is barriers placed in front of voters that can be a hindrance to the ability to participate in an election. For example, some states adopted, and I know I've already talked about this, same-day voter registration. That makes it easier for those who don't remember 30 days prior to the election to set your calendars to make sure that you are registered to vote. Right? Other restrictions can include, banning 24-hour voting. It could be banning curbside voting. We'll talk about those issues in just a moment. Other ways to prohibit or hinder certain people from being able to vote. That's a restriction. Versus voting rights, right? The idea that there should be no infringement on my ability to cast a vote. It should be as easy as possible, right, to cast a ballot legally. Right? Well, let's talk about voter fraud in Texas, because most of the time, those who support more restrictions to the ballot box, they argue, well, we got to prevent voter fraud. And voter fraud is real. It does exist. It's just low here in the great state of Texas. How low are you? How low exactly? Well, according to this comes from a news article. According to the records from the Texas Attorney General's office, there were a total of 534 offenses, charges to 154 people. Some had multiple offenses for either mail ballot fraud, assistant fraud, or illegally voting since 2004. Let me say that again. A total of 534 offenses since 2004. Okay. Among those 534 offenses, 310 were for mail-in ballot fraud, 159 were for assistant fraud, and 189 were for illegally voting. A total of 272 charges of the 534 offenses resolved were from the 2015 to March 2021. So, how predominant is voter fraud? It's not that much. It does exist. It does happen. Let's be clear. But it's not as widespread or as predominant as sometimes we make it out to be. So this leads us up to this. In 2021 legislative session, Senate Bill 1 banned drive-through voting, set new photo ID requirements for voting by mail. It provides partisan poll watchers with more autonomy, more power, more authority at the polls, and it outlaws 24 voting and curbside voting. 24-hour voting is exactly what it sounds like. It's a polling place open for 24 hours. This allows people who work nights to be able to participate in elections. Right? So we see that a lot in the Houston area. Why? Because we have a lot of hospitals and nurses and doctors who work nights. Right? Curbside voting. What is curbside voting? I'm so glad you asked that. Curbside voting is for people who are disabled, who it's difficult for them to get around. They can literally stay in the vehicle when an election worker comes out with their ballot for them to complete in their car and then given to the election worker to take it back into the polling place. That's what curbside voting is. This is a way for those who have a mobility disability to be able to participate in an election. Right? But we've outlawed that now as of 2021 legislative session. So with the amount of voter fraud that we do have, because it does exist, does that warrant the response that we've had, specifically with Senate Bill 1 from the 2021 legislative session? For some of us, we may say yes. For some of us, we may say no. But this is a policy issue that we are dealing with here in the great state of Texas. All right, so what can we do? Right, we've talked about what is public policy, some challenges that we are facing. Right, let's talk now about what can you and I as individuals do. If we want to influence public policy, how can we get involved? Well, we can get involved by several different ways, by a host of methods here. Okay, by no means is this an exhaustive list, by the way. This isn't. This is just a short list to help us understand how we can get involved. We can sign petitions, political petitions that are advocating for some kind of change or no change. We can join an interest group that aligns with your specific ideals and beliefs for which you have. Whether that's a trade association, whether that's a religious association, whatever the situation is, whatever interest for which you have, you can join an interest group which bolsters that group to mobilize them to engage with the legislature and to advocate for a base, the people who subscribe to them, to and keep you informed when action is required and what kind of action can you take. It keeps you informed. Attend government meetings like county commissioners court meetings and city council meetings. Find out from your local political party, right, when candidates are going to be in town, and go and go to those events and actually communicate, talk with, meet, tell your representatives what you think, right? Call or write your representatives. They may not come. You may not want to go to a meeting, okay? And I get that. I totally do. But call or write your representatives in government. It's that simple. Right? You can volunteer for a political party or a candidate. I promise you, they are always looking for people. Always. Okay? Write letters to an editor of a major newspaper advocating for a specific issue. You want change in this issue, or you want to keep the status quo. Whatever the case may be, whatever it may be, get involved that way. And finally, use social media. Yes, create a YouTube video calling for political action, right? Use social media to start debating and start conversations about this issue that you care so much about, right? We often think of voting as the apex of political participation. And by the way, vote according to your conscience. Vote according to your beliefs, your viewpoints. Okay? Absolutely, by all means do that. But voting, while we should do it, and I hope you are, and that should be on this list, by the way, we often think of it as that's the only thing I can do. We can see from this list, there's a host of other things we can do. We can influence policy makers by lobbying, right? We can influence who those policy makers are by volunteering for a political party or a candidate. We can have input, right, on multiple levels here. So if there is an issue that you care deeply about, get involved. Get involved. Sign petitions, join interest groups, attend government meetings, call or write your legislators or your representatives, volunteer for a political party or a candidate. Write those letters to the editor, bring to the attention, calling upon the collective consciousness of us and informing of us of this policy position or this issue that's going on. Use social media to carry on that thought, to bring this to our awareness, to have those conversations. I digress. But I think you get my point here. So this is the conclusion of this lecture. So if there's anything I've said that doesn't make sense or you have some questions about, please feel free to email me. And until next time, peace.